Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at the attack that happened in New Orleans on New Year's Day,
Yeah.
right on Bourbon Street. So we've got a couple articles here, one from WWL-TV and one from Newsweek, and we're going to try to unpack this thing together and see what we can learn from it.
This is good.
You know, I think everybody can already kind of picture it in their minds. New Orleans, Bourbon Street, New Year's Eve. It's a night of celebration, and it turns into a nightmare.
It really does make you think about, how vulnerable we are.
Yeah.
Especially during times when you're supposed to be, carefree and joyful.
Right. So let's get into what happened. Around 3:15 in the morning on New Year's Day, a man drove a rented white Ford F-150 Lightning pickup truck right into a crowd of people on Bourbon Street.
Wow.
And this wasn't just some drunk driver. This appears to be very deliberate.
That's right. Both articles really emphasize that the driver, later identified as Shamsud-Din Bahar, was really hell-bent on creating carnage. He was even wearing body armor, which, suggests that this was premeditated, which is incredibly chilling when you think about it.
Yeah, and it gets even worse. He had what they're calling a long gun, so think like a rifle or something like that.
Okay.
Fitted with a suppressor.
Yeah.
A suppressor is a device that muffles the sound of the gunshot, so it makes them harder to detect.
Right.
After he crashes the truck, he gets out, and he starts shooting at the police.
Wow. So this is really starting to look like a planned attack, rather than somebody just kind of snapping in a moment of rage.
Right.
Because he injured 2 officers in the shootout, which shows a willingness to engage in violence that's pretty disturbing. It's like he came prepared for a fight.
Yeah, he was ready for it. The truck itself adds another layer of mystery to this whole thing. It had a Texas license plate.
Yeah.
And get this, it had a covered flag on a pole attached to the back. And so there's already tons of theories flying around about what that flag might represent.
Right. But it's really important to be cautious about jumping to conclusions.
Yeah.
We don't want to spread misinformation.
Right. We need to wait for official word from the authorities.
Exactly.
Before we start speculating about what that flag might symbolize.
Yeah, you got it.
So the attack happened near the intersection of Bourbon and Canal Streets.
Okay.
Which is like one of the most crowded spots
Oh, yeah, for sure.
during New Year's celebrations. So very deliberately targeted.
Yeah, that's a detail that really jumps out at you, isn't it? Because it is such a busy location on New Year's Eve.
Right.
It's just a tragically effective way to cause maximum damage.
It is. It's just heartbreaking. 12 people were killed and at least 35 injured.
Oh, my goodness.
It seems like most of the victims were local residents, but we're still waiting on more detailed information about them.
It's hard to even fathom the impact this will have on the New Orleans community. Losing loved ones in such a sudden and violent way is devastating enough. But this also just shatters their sense of safety in a place that holds so much meaning for them.
Right. So let's talk about the suspect.
Okay.
Shamsud-Din Bahar. He was 42 years old, and he was killed in the shootout with police. The articles mention that he had an ISIS flag in the truck.
That's obviously a huge red flag.
Yeah. And to make things even more complicated, an improvised explosive device,
Right.
an IED, was found at the scene.
Oh, wow. And both sources confirmed that the IED was viable. So in other words, it could have detonated and caused even more destruction. This dramatically raises the stakes of the situation.
Yeah, thank goodness it didn't go off. But it's terrifying to think about what could have happened.
Absolutely. The discovery of this viable IED is going to lead to a lot of questions for investigators. Was Jabbar planning to detonate it himself? Was it meant to be like a secondary device to create even more chaos after the initial attack? We don't have the answers yet.
Right. And here's another big question. Was he acting alone?
Right.
Or was he part of a larger network?
Yeah, that's what the FBI is going to be working around the clock to try to figure out. It's vital to understand the full scope of the threat that we're dealing with here. Are there other potential dangers out there?
Right. It sounds like Jabbar had been in the U.S. for at least a couple of months before the attack. The truck that he used was rented in Texas.
Okay.
And it crossed the border on November 16th. But here's what's interesting. It seems like the truck changed hands at some point.
Now, that's a fascinating detail. It begs the question, how did Jabbar end up with the truck?
Yeah.
And was anybody else aware of his plans?
Yeah.
That's something the FBI is going to be digging into for sure.
Yeah, and so far, there's been no official word on whether they've identified the original driver or if they believe that person is connected to the attack in any way.
I see.
I guess it's still pretty early in the investigation.
Yeah, it's going to take time. But, I'm confident that New Orleans will find a way to heal.
And rebuild? I hope so. Cities have come back from terrible tragedies before. But this one feels different somehow. Maybe it's because it happened on a holiday or in a place so associated with like joy and celebration.
Yeah, I think it cuts deeper, for sure. And, it's important to acknowledge the fear and uncertainty. That will linger for a while.
Right.
But New Orleans has always been a resilient city. It's been through hurricanes, floods, you name it. And they always come back stronger.
Yeah. Speaking of coming back stronger, what about the Sugar Bowl? That's a huge event for New Orleans, both culturally and economically.
Yeah, it was still scheduled to go ahead as planned.
Yeah.
Which I think sends an important message. You can't let these acts of terror completely paralyze you. Life has to go on. But it's going to be hard for people to really celebrate with this tragedy hanging over the city.
Right. Turning to some of the official responses, Mayor LaToya Cantrell did not mince words. She immediately called this a terrorist attack.
Right, and that was even before the FBI's official confirmation. So that tells you something about the immediate impact of this event. You can imagine the pressure she was under to reassure her city and project a sense of control, even in the face of such chaos.
Right. Governor Jeff Landry called it a horrific act of violence and urged people to stay away from the area. While the investigation was underway, President Joe Biden was briefed on the situation and offered federal support to New Orleans.
Yeah, the swift response from both state and federal officials really shows just how seriously they're taking this.
Yeah.
This isn't just a local issue anymore. It's a national concern.
Right. And we also saw some strong reactions from other political figures. House Speaker Mike Johnson called for swift justice.
Okay.
Louisiana Attorney General Liz Murrill vowed to ensure justice for the victims and their families. Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy expressed gratitude for the bravery of the responding police officers.
These reactions really highlight the wide-ranging impact of this event. People are searching for answers, for justice, and for someone to be held accountable.
It seems like everybody's looking for answers. Even Donald Trump, who's usually pretty vocal on social media, simply called it pure evil.
Wow, which is a pretty understated response for him. It seems like even the most divisive figures recognize the sheer horror of what happened. This is a time when people are putting aside their differences and coming together in shared grief and outrage.
I think you're right. There's been a lot of talk about the security measures on Bourbon Street, specifically those bollards that are meant to prevent vehicles from entering pedestrian areas. It turns out they were down for repairs.
Oh, really?
When the attack happened. And Councilmember Helena Moreno specifically pointed this out, saying that Jabbar was able to drive onto Bourbon Street because those bollards weren't in place.
Wow. So does this raise questions about security protocols in the city? Were there lapses that might have contributed to this tragedy?
It's hard to know for sure, but they lead to even bigger questions about how cities like New Orleans, which thrive on tourism and open public spaces, can balance safety and accessibility.
Right. It's a difficult challenge, especially in a place like the French Quarter, with its narrow streets and historic architecture.
You're right, there's no easy answer, but it's a conversation that city leaders and security experts are going to have. How do you protect vulnerable areas without turning them into fortresses? It's a delicate balance.
Exactly. And it's not just a local issue. Cities all over the world are grappling with this challenge in the face of these evolving threats.
You're right. Now let's talk about the IED for a minute. You mentioned earlier that it was viable. Can you explain what that means in this context?
Sure. Viable means that it was a functional device. It was capable of detonating. This wasn't just a prop or a hoax. It was a real bomb, and it had the potential to cause significant damage.
So do we know what kind of IED it was? Was it sophisticated?
The sources don't go into a lot of technical detail about the IED, but it's worth noting that building a viable IED does require a certain level of knowledge and skill. It's not something you just throw together.
Right.
So this suggests a degree of planning and preparation. That's quite concerning.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what the intended target was. Was the truck attack meant to be a distraction, or was the IED supposed to be the main event, with the truck attack serving as a way to maximize casualties?
Those are all possibilities that investigators are going to be exploring. One theory is that the truck attack was meant to draw a large crowd, which would make the IED even more deadly.
That's chilling. I don't even want to think about what the death toll could have been if that IED had detonated.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder of the destructive power of these devices.
Yeah.
And the level of threat we're facing.
It makes you question how we, as a society, can effectively combat extremism and prevent these kinds of attacks from happening.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But one thing that stands out to me from these sources is the emphasis on community resilience Despite the horror of this attack, there's a clear sense that New Orleans will come together, support each other, and eventually rebuild.
That's what's so inspiring about the human spirit. Even in the darkest of times, there's always that flicker of hope and determination.
Yeah. Yeah, it really makes you think about that delicate balance,
Yeah.
between security and freedom, especially in a city like New Orleans
Right.
that relies so heavily on tourism and its vibrant, open atmosphere.
Yeah, you don't want to turn the French Quarter into like a fortress, but you also want people to feel safe.
Right.
How do you strike that balance?
It's a tough question,
Yeah.
and there are no easy answers. But I think this attack will force cities across the country, and maybe even the world, to reevaluate their security measures.
Yeah.
Do we need more bollards, more surveillance, or do we focus on intelligence gathering and prevention?
Yeah, and what about the impact on tourism? I mean, New Orleans depends on visitors, and something like this could really hurt their economy.
That's a very real concern. The French Quarter, especially Bourbon Street, is a huge draw for tourists. And now people might be hesitant to visit, especially around big events.
Right, so it'll be interesting to see how the city addresses those concerns and works to rebuild its image as a safe and welcoming destination. But it's not just about the economics, though, is it? This attack will have a lasting impact on the people who live in New Orleans.
You're absolutely right. We can't forget about the human cost of this tragedy. The trauma, the grief, the fear. Those are things that will take a long time to heal.
Thinking about the suspect for a second, Shamsud-Din Bahar and his possible motives. Do the articles offer any insights into his background? Was he a lone wolf, or was he part of a larger group?
Unfortunately, the articles don't provide a lot of details about his past. We know that he rented the truck in Texas. But beyond that, his background is still pretty murky. And that's something the FBI is going to be focusing on, trying to piece together his life, his connections, and what might have led him to commit this act.
Right. You mentioned earlier that his actions seem to align with some of the hallmarks of terrorism. Can you expand on that a little?
Sure. When you look at the combination of factors here, the deliberate targeting of civilians, the use of a vehicle as a weapon, the presence of the ISIS flag, the viable IED, it starts to fit a pattern that we've seen in other terrorist attacks.
So does that mean that he was definitely connected to ISIS? Or could he have just been like a lone actor, inspired by their ideology?
It's still too early to say for sure. It's possible that he was acting on his own, but was inspired by ISIS propaganda or online materials.
Yeah.
Or he could have had direct contact with the group, received training, or even been directed to carry out the attack. These are all questions the investigators are going to be trying to answer.
This attack comes at a time when we've seen a rise in politically motivated violence and extremism.
Yeah.
Do you think this event will have any broader implications for how we address those issues?
I think it's inevitable that this attack will spark renewed conversations about security, both domestically and internationally. We'll likely see increased scrutiny of border security, immigration policies, and efforts to counter online radicalization. It's a complex issue with no easy solutions, but it's one that we can't ignore.
This is a lot to process. This whole event is just so tragic.
It is. But amidst all the darkness, I think it's important to remember that there's also hope. We see it in the resilience of the people of New Orleans, in the bravery of the first responders, and in the outpouring of support from around the world.
You're right. Even in the face of such horror, we see the best of humanity shining through. It's a reminder that even though we face these challenges, we're not alone in facing them.
And that brings us to a final thought for you to consider. How do events like this change our perceptions of safety and security, both personally and as a society? And how can we as individuals contribute to creating a world where such tragedies become less frequent? It's a heavy question, but one that's worth pondering as we try to make sense of this senseless act.
Well, thank you for joining us today as we delved into this very difficult and tragic event. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families, and the entire city of New Orleans, as they begin the long process of healing and rebuilding.